Welcome to a devlog for something different. This past weekend, we took part in GM48, a 48-hour game jam specifically for games made with GameMaker, the engine we use for our projects. GM48 is on the smaller end of game jams, with only 68 games submitted this time around. That makes it a bit less intimidating than other jams, as well as a little more community-focused. The theme for this jam was Two Sides. On the first day of the jam, we tried to brainstorm ideas for a game that would fit the theme. We ended up settling on creating an auto battler, a pretty new genre of game that started with the Dota 2 custom game Auto Chess, and has since been replicated by games like Dota Underlords and Teamfight Tactics. These games are simple to play, but have particularly deep mechanics, something I felt would be a fun challenge to try to program in 48 hours. Many game developers who participate in jams mention having a problem with overscoping, planning a final product that's way too big to deliver on in such a short time. I feel like I have the opposite problem, where I manage the scope of my game so well that I don't learn anything from the experience. I've been using GameMaker for over a decade at this point, and I know how to make simple games like platformers. I'd rather use the experience of a game jam to push myself towards learning something new. This game ended up being more of a time crunch than the other games we've made, but I see that as a good thing more than a bad thing. Ross, the artist of our team, wanted to experiment with a 1-bit style, where all the art in the game is drawn with a single color. With these ideas in place, we got to work. While I felt the original idea met the theme of two sides, Ross had a suggestion to double down on the theme. He suggested that we allow players to combine units, creating a unit where each of its two sides was a different character. I liked the idea, and we decided to move ahead with it. First, we decided on the elements of the game. In an auto battler, generally units will be one or more alliances. By placing enough units of the same alliance on their board, a player will get a bonus. This makes the placing of characters on the board really strategic, since you need to manage a combination of getting the right alliances in a limited number of units. We opened up a Google Doc and wrote in the ideas we had for alliances, or as we'd later call them, elements. We ended up making 6: fire, water, light, plant, void, and ground, and came up with different passive effects for when you had 2 of them, as well as when you had 4 of them. Ross then started with the art, and I got started with the code. In this first old build of the game, we can see the start of Reedy's art. He drew 18 simple characters, 3 for each of the 6 elements. If I press the spacebar, I can randomize the appearance of these characters, and we can see the different split versions of them. The next build allows you to spawn random characters by right-clicking in the grid. Getting the position of the mouse inside this grid would be important to future versions, and being able to spawn characters was a good tool to have for testing the game. Next, I added the shop. Nothing costs money in this build, but players can drag units from the shop onto their side of the board, and the shop can be restocked with this button. Hovering over a unit also shows you its name. That was all the progress I made that night, and while it doesn't seem like a lot, many of the underlying systems in the game were being worked on, stuff that couldn't really be shown until later. The next morning, I made a build that adds of the first bit of gameplay. You can now right-click to add enemies to the opponent's side of the board, and drag units from the shop to put on your side of the board. Pressing space then causes the battle to start, and the units will attack each other. The side that loses will lose a heart, and all the units will be reset to their earlier positions. I also improved the names of the units. Each unit now has a 2-word name, and combining units takes the first word from the first name and the second word from the second name. For example, combining Eldritch Altar with Pedestrian Fish would make either an Eldritch Fish or a Pedestrian Altar. On a surface level, not much looks different in the next build, but there were some big changes. First of all, characters now had additional bars below their health that tracked the cooldown of their spells. Every time that bar empties, the unit casts their spell. Spells aren't actually in the game yet, but the fact that units can cast them means that the light passive can start working. The fire and ground passives are also working at this point. In this version, some spells have been set up and some new graphics from Ross have made their way into the game, including improved hearts and shop icons. The rounds can also be started through a new Start Round button instead of having to click the spacebar. The next version is a pretty big change in the game, and by that, I mean the size of the game. Ross decided that he wasn't a fan of the way his art looked chopped up into 2 pieces and stuck together, so we instead went with a card look. Now, when you place a unit on the board, it stays as a card, the same way it looked in the shop, and combining 2 units puts both of them in the same card. The health bar and cooldown bars also now show up on the card instead of over the character like it was before. This increased size is also great for showing more text on the sides of the screen, something I'll be adding soon. Also, while it's been there for a while, the trash can finally works, and players can delete unwanted units off their board. Of course, this new look doesn't really echo the theme of two sides like the previous version did, but I still felt like the game fit the theme by virtue of there being, well, two sides to the board. The 8th build of the game offers some improvements as well. A unit's stats and abilities are now shown on the left side of the screen below their name. Showing what a unit can actually do is a hugely important part of this game, because without that, the player can't make strategic decisions. Also, the enemy cards are now red instead of white, to help signify which side it is during combat. Previously, the health bars were different, but we didn't feel like it was enough of a change from one side to the other to successfully follow the action. Also at this point in the game, all the spells, element bonuses, and passive abilities have been completed. Further changes to units are pretty much only for balancing purposes. On the right side of the screen, you'll see a panel that will track the completed elements the player has, but for now it does nothing. The next build of the game adds AI. Just kidding, we didn't actually have time to build a robust AI for the player to fight against. Instead, I set up patterns for the computer to create different builds. Since there can only be at most 7 rounds before someone loses all their health, I just needed to create 7 layouts for the computer to put on the board, one for each round the game goes. The shop is also, well, a shop. Players start with 5 gold and get an increasing amount of gold every round of the game. They can spend this gold on units, spending 2 gold to reroll the units in the shop, or spend an increasing amount of gold to level up. Your level shows how many units can be placed on your side of the board at once, so it's really important. The addition of gold and an actually competent enemy puts this game one step closer to having gameplay, near the very end of the second day. That was the end of all the work on the second day. At this point, there was only 18 hours left on the third day to finish the game. The morning of the third day, I wrote some music for the game. There are 3 different variations, although they're all the same song essentially. The first version is for the title screen and cuts out the drums and bass to sound more calm. The second version adds the bass and the drums to make it sound more upbeat. Finally, the last version plays while your units are fighting. It adds an arpeggio that plays along with the chords to sound more frantic. These versions blend smoothly with each other as the game is played. In terms of the game itself, there's now a menu. We decided to call the game Hybrid Commander, since you command an army of hybrids. This menu has a volume slider, a button to change the game to full screen, a button to close the game, and of course one to start. Once in-game, there's a button to take you back to the menu, and the sidebar that shows the elements is finally functional. You can see how many units you have for each element, and completed tiers are marked with a star. Hovering your mouse over a tier will show you what passive you get for completing it. Finally, there's also an end screen to the game, which shows whether you won or lost and prompts you to either play again or return to the main menu. The final version includes some minor changes and polishing. There's a tutorial for first-time players that walks through the controls and explains the placing of units on the board, fusing units, and more. There's also a counter in the top of the screen which shows how many units have been placed on your side of the board, to make it more clear why you can't place a unit. Also, there are a lot of balancing changes, changing the stats of over or under power units, and some last-minute bug fixing. Finally, I added even more patterns for the enemy player to use to make the game more replayable. That's it for Hybrid Commander. This was a really fun experience, and I'm glad we pushed ourselves working on this game. There are for sure some things I would change if I had more time, but I'm overall quite happy with how it turned out. If you want to try the finished game yourself, you can play and rate it on the GM48 website. I've left a link to that in the description. Please note that the game unfortunately only runs on Windows. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this Game Jam devlog. If you want to see more from us and the game we're making that's taking a lot longer than 48 hours, I'd love it if you subscribed. Thanks, and have a great day.